All right. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm looking at our participants list and I see a lot of familiar faces as well as a couple of new ones. So welcome to all of you. I'm really, really excited for our conversation today. I'm hoping it will touch upon a lot of the topics surrounding racism in our criminal justice system that have been top of mind for so many of us over the past couple of weeks. I'll start with a little bit about myself. My name is Sally Sala. I co-manage Women's Wire social media presence with Carolyn. And I work in tech, but I'm really, really passionate about gender and racial equality. Today, I have the privilege of introducing you to Hannah Oppermann. I was really lucky to meet Hannah my freshman year of college when we lived on the same floor. And Hannah has far surpassed our freshman year dreams. In 2019, she graduated with a master's from American University in public anthropology, where she wrote her thesis on the child welfare system. She currently works at the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform in Washington, D.C., where she works to educate systems leaders on research and best practices on how to improve outcomes for children in the juvenile justice and child welfare systems. So if anyone's camera is on, please wave to Hannah and say hi. And if not, that's fine. You guys can be shy and stay with your cameras off, and we'll just pretend we're on a group FaceTime. So yeah, I wanted to transition into our questions. And Hannah, I'm hoping we can start with a little bit of a conversation about your work. So I'm really curious what drew you to this type of work.
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Sally, and the rest of the Women's Wire team for having me today and for everyone for being here. I'm really, really excited to have this conversation. I sort of stumbled into this work. I would say it was a little bit accidental and also inevitable. I always say I became an anthropologist because my only skill is critical thinking, but basically, I spent college and undergrad really trying to understand and intellectualize a lot of the systems that impacted my life. So that was primarily mental health system and the military. And then while I was in grad school, I started to expand my framework of understanding, and I really wanted to find a way to apply that in a concrete way. And so while I was looking for jobs, I found a job as a research assistant at the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, and I've been there ever since. But simultaneously with that, I also sort of expanded my reading about juvenile justice, child welfare, the criminal legal system as a whole, and then that led me to abolition. So I've been reading and studying about abolition for a while as well. And then I became connected with a few other organizations here in DC who are working on related issues. I just want to give the quick disclaimer that I'm talking on behalf of myself today, not necessarily my work. So all opinions are my own, but I draw on all of my experience and my research.
I love that. Got to make sure people know whose views you're representing. So always good to make that disclaimer. So I'm really, really curious how all of the newfound cultural attention on policing and our criminal justice has shifted your day-to-day work.
Mhm. It's definitely put more attention on our work, I would say, which is something that I really try to sit with because the reasons that people are more interested in my work now are quite unfortunate. But I do think that it's shifted the world of possibilities. Like people are more open to things or things that would have seemed unrealistic or unthinkable even a few months ago now seem possible. And for people who work in these areas, it's really reinvigorated everyone and made it seem like we can do things differently, we can do things better, we can reaffirm our commitment, whatever. But I do think it's sort of opened up the door for a lot more possibilities.
Mm, that's really exciting. What do you wish people knew about your work on the juvenile justice system?
I thought a lot about this because I don't think many people know a lot about the juvenile justice system. So, the two things that I really wanted to hammer home, number one, the juvenile justice system is not just like one thing or one agency. It is expansive, it varies across jurisdictions and location, and it encompasses both law enforcement and courts, but also public agencies, different departments within agencies. So any sort of change that's going to take place in juvenile justice has to work across all of these different institutions, but it also has to involve all of the agencies or systems that touch kids' lives in general. So that includes education and behavioral health, and also communities and families. I don't think you can talk meaningfully about the juvenile justice system in an isolated sense. I do think it's kind of all encompassing because kids are so much a product of their communities and their environments. And then the other thing that I really wish people would sort of focus on when they're thinking about juvenile justice is that these really are kids that we're talking about here, and 30% of all juvenile arrests are of kids under age 15. About half of all kids who are incarcerated are 16 and 17, but that means that the rest are not. And so I think kids don't stop being kids just because they've done something wrong or they've committed some kind of harm. And I think really taking that to heart is important when you're talking about the juvenile justice system.
That makes so much sense. Yeah, I feel like what you said about kids being kids is super,
Mhm.
super important and something that we all need to remember. Now, I kind of want to zoom out to the bigger justice system, kind of encompassing the juvenile justice system as well as the adult justice system. I feel like in the past couple of weeks, I've heard a lot of language about how we can transform our criminal justice system. People have thrown around a lot of different phrases like prison abolition, defunding the police, criminal justice reform. How would you define each of these and what do they actually look like in practice?
That's a really good question and a really big one to tackle because these are all frameworks and political visions and ideas that have so much history and theorizing and organizing behind them. But just really generally speaking, criminal justice reform is the idea, it's based on the idea that the system that we have is broken or it's not working exactly as we would want a system to work. So we need to make changes that have it, that produce the outcome that we're looking for, that like increase people's safety or make people feel like it's doing the job that it's supposed to, but it wouldn't fundamentally change the system that we have in place. Like these are the proposed reforms will vary, but in general, the system that we have would stay intact with criminal justice reform. This is things like reducing mass incarceration, so like trying to decrease the number of people who are incarcerated, but not necessarily like never incarcerating anyone. That's contrasted with prison industrial complex abolition, which is the idea. It's both a political vision and an organizing strategy, and so much more, which is the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, surveillance, and punishment entirely. Um, there's so many theorists who have talked about what abolition is, but I always come back to the Ruth Wilson Gilmore definition, which is abolition is presence. So it's not just building up, or excuse me, tearing down the buildings that we call prisons, but it's building up whole communities in order to address social and economic problems without relying on surveillance and policing and imprisonment.
Mm.
Defund the police. So, if you're still with me, everyone, defund the police is a sub strategy of abolition. So, it is the current demand that's come forth from groups like Black Lives Matter or Movement for Black Lives, which is basically saying we place a lot of money into the system of policing in this country, and it's not giving us the outcome that we want as communities. So we want to take funding away from police and allocate that to services that would help our communities. So that could be education, it could be healthcare, it just depends. And defund the police as an abolitionist demand is one strategy because eventually in an abolitionist future, there would be no police, but it's only one piece of the pie. It also involves building up community supports and just fundamentally altering our relationships so that we're not relying on police to solve our problems.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really important distinction that the defunding of the police is just kind of a stepping stone on the route to full prison abolition. So thank you for making that distinction and for giving us these definitions because I feel like
You're
that's always
welcome.
helpful as we're trying to navigate new concepts. I'm curious if there are any top myths you'd like to debunk about our criminal justice system. I feel like I've heard a couple, like that prison abolition means that people who've committed crimes just get to go free, or that things like body cams and community policing and bias training programs will kind of solve the problem of police brutality.
Hmm. Yeah, happy to debunk those, or rather to encourage a little bit more thought about those kinds of claims. The first one about body cams, community policing, and bias training programs. Those reforms have already been in place in many jurisdictions around the country. After Ferguson, there was a massive push for body cams. And as we've seen the last few weeks, that hasn't had a terribly meaningful impact in police behavior, mostly because it doesn't fundamentally alter the structure of the police or what they are there to do. It doesn't alter their purpose. It actually just gives them a different technology to use. And so a lot of times, police body cam footage is used as evidence against defendants, which is sort of the opposite of what it was supposed to be used for. I think that building off of that, one myth that I would like to debunk is the idea that police killing is the only harm that could come from an interaction with police. But that's in fact only like one small sliver of the ways these interactions could be harmful. It could be anything from different kinds of non-lethal force, so deployment of tear gas and pepper spray against protesters. Like, I would argue that's a form of harm or violence that could come from that, but also just the toll that arrest takes on people and on communities. It involves removing people from their communities. There's financial costs involved. And so if you're only focusing on that ultimate, really unfortunate ending with a police killing, you're sort of missing the whole rest of the picture. And that's why reforms like that don't fundamentally change that in any meaningful way. The idea that prison abolition means people who have committed crimes will just go free with no accountability it's a common one, and it's like a genuine fear that people feel, because we do want to live in a world where people take accountability for harm that they've caused. And so that's why you will hear a lot of abolitionists talking about harm specifically, not necessarily crime. Sort of decoupling that framework can be helpful for understanding what it is we want out of a system. And abolition is about building up relationships so that people take accountability for the harm that they've caused in relationship with others. Like, it's about community forms of accountability. It's about restoring something that's lost when a harm is committed, things like that. And so it wouldn't just mean that we don't care if anyone does something terrible to someone else. But I also would encourage people who are thinking about this to just look at what the system we have now is doing. Nationwide, only about 50% of all murders result in an arrest, like, period. So if your concern is that murderers go free, like, we're it's kind of a toss-up now as to whether we're addressing it. So I do think there's room to think about alternatives without, like, inducing panic.
Mm. I think that's so wise. Yeah. And I totally understand where that concern comes from. But I think, yeah, showing that the system that we currently have is fairly ineffective in actually mitigating the harm that we're talking about, is kind of a crucial point in understanding why this changed so badly. Um, I am really curious because I feel like at Women's Wire, everything we talk about, we're kind of looking at through a feminist lens. How do you feel like the movement for criminal justice transformation is a feminist issue?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I really like that about Women's Wire. I think that it's a feminist issue for quite a variety of reasons. Just a few ways to point out how the system now is currently failing women. One would be that currently 225,000 women are incarcerated today, and that number is increasing at a rate way faster than the rate of incarceration for men was increasing. So from 1980 to 2017, the rate of incarceration for women increased 750%. So that's a huge jump.
Yeah,
It's a huge
that is crazy.
jump. More specifically, 60% of women in prisons nationwide have experienced physical or sexual abuse before being incarcerated. So we're really incarcerating survivors, sometimes criminalizing the act of surviving, either through defense or other like thefts that involve surviving in an abusive world. But also, prisons and forms of punishment are also, they rely on sexual violence as punishment. So there's just a number of different ways that women are being failed by the current system that we have. Also, the same disparities that we see in terms of race and sexual orientation are present for women as well. So Black women and then women who identify as lesbian or bisexual are disproportionately subjected to incarceration. So I do think that any sort of meaningful engagement with reforming our current system or changing or abolishing will really require an intersectional feminist lens to understand the specifically racialized and gendered ways that women experience the system.
Mm, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And yeah, it just emphasizes the importance of taking into that intersectionality across the board. Um, I also want to know, because I know that you, for a lot of us, thinking about the criminal justice system to this degree is kind of new, but for you, this is something that you deal with every day in your day-to-day work. Um, how have you been taking care of your mental health and kind of processing all of this everything? Because I feel like I mean, for me personally, it's been really challenging to think through, and it's a lot of trauma to consume. So I'm curious about how you take care of yourself and if you have any tips.
Yeah, well, I don't know that I have tips because I will say I don't think I do a very good job of that. But I do try, because I am constantly sort of inundated with these kinds of topics, I'm always reading something depressing. I do try to balance that out with reading something more enjoyable. I love reading fiction and nonfiction kind of simultaneously so I can go with my mood. Also, just in these quarantine times, I think getting out of the house has been really important. So running is something I use to really clear my mind and focus on other things. Sort of use my rage at the system to fuel my runs. I find that works really, really well. But in general, I don't know that I do the best job of like switching off or avoiding sort of news updates or anything like that. But it's a constant struggle.
Yeah, and it's a hard balance because you do want to stay informed and know what's happening, and then also want to make sure that you're, taking care of yourself so you can be as effective as possible in your work, which is so important. So I understand
Mhm.
it's tricky. Do you have any good fiction recommendations for our listeners?
So I do. I'm almost done with it. I have approximately 50 pages left in this book called The Shadow of the Wind. It was given to me by a friend who said it was the best book she's ever read. So,
High praise.
yeah. And I was like, that can't be true. But it is really good. It's like, I think it's historical fiction, kind of a weird genre that I don't usually tap into, but it is very interesting. Would recommend. And it's long and it's been really engrossing and very distracting.
Okay, cool. That's interesting. I will add that to my list. And hopefully, the people listening can do the same. Um, I feel like I'm just curious as a person whose work isn't criminal justice day to day, how I can get more involved in the movement and how the folks listening can be a little bit more active in changing the systems.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there are so many different ways to get involved. My first recommendation would be to look into how the system operates in your local community. So I'm based in DC, but for anyone else who's listening from other cities, I would look into there are almost certainly organizations who are working on these issues in your community. So you can try to get involved with them, find out what the local movements are, but also just look into how the system operates. Like, where is your local jail? Who is your local district attorney? A lot of times, prosecutors, judges, and mayors who have a lot of control over the system in local areas are elected officials. So you can vote in elections for those people. In terms of if you're looking to learn more or read more, I have a few recommendations. Sort of my absolute favorite people to read from are Miriam Kaba, Angela Davis, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore. But there's like a whole host of other people, predominantly like Black women and trans women who have really led the way in this kind of thinking. And then in terms of quicker responses, 8toabolition.com, which was created in a response to 8 Can't Wait, is a really good resource. They have like short things that are shareable on social media, but also a lot more resources for you to dive in and start thinking about how this can actually work. And then Interrupting Criminalization just put out a toolkit that's really, really helpful if you're interested in beginning to understand this in your community. They also have like city by city list of organizations who are working on these things. So if you go to interruptingcriminalization.com, that's a good place to start as well.
Ooh, okay. Taking notes. That is very good to know. And we can make sure to share out those resources on our social platforms as well so everyone has an easy way to find them. Yeah, I really appreciate resources. I feel like doing the reading is super important at this time, especially with so much misinformation circulating around social media. So knowing who's a reliable source is very, very useful. So now I'm going to pivot over to some audience questions we received. We actually fielded a couple of questions from Instagram in advance, and then I know Carolyn has also received a couple from the chat. If you have any more, feel free to just drop them into the chat, and we can also add those to our list. Um, so the first question is someone wrote that one question they'd be interested in hearing about from you is whether you feel like the more widespread racial reckoning right now will have an impact on your work slash the juvenile justice system more broadly. And I think you touched upon that a little bit earlier, but if you could expand, that'd be great.
Yeah, I definitely think it will slash already has. I know for my work, like race equity has always been kind of one of our pillars of foundation. If you're going to reform the system, like that should be front and center. But I do think that number one, current attention just offers more opportunities. Like I said, it's like it's a big moment in terms of opportunities for change. But I also think people are more aware, people are being held accountable in different ways. I think that the widespread changes that are going on, hopefully those can be sustained, but I do think that it will have an impact on juvenile justice and on the larger system as a whole. I think that is one thing that hopefully will come of this.
Another question we got was a little bit more specifically about the juvenile justice system. So, one person was wondering if there are programs to transition juvenile offenders back into society and school, or do most of them end up falling behind and not completing their educations?
That's a really hard question for a number of reasons, partly just because that is not necessarily my area of expertise. But I will say, yes, reentry programs, or sometimes it's called aftercare, do exist for kids who are returning from out of home placements. And a number one sort of aspect of reform is really involving people, especially families and communities, throughout a kid's time in the juvenile justice system so that that transition is not like leaving someone with nothing to do. The idea is to set kids up for success once they do return to their communities. There's also a widespread move towards keeping kids in communities the whole time instead of removing kids from communities to keep them there so that they aren't taken away from their school and their family and things like that, and they can maintain that. The reason that's also a hard question is because there is definitely a link between the juvenile justice system and schools and not finishing schools and things like that. So I don't know any like stats off the top of my head for how that is. And I do know that there's not great data collection for aftercare and reentry across the country. Like it's not a nationwide thing that's tracked. So it would vary by state or county or city in terms of who's keeping track of those data. So I don't know exactly like what percentage of kids graduate from high school once they return, but I do know that that is a really important part of reform and of improving the outcomes for kids is to keep them connected to schools and to communities.
That makes a lot of sense. Another question we got was, what resources would you recommend for people wanting to learn more, educate others about abolition specifically? So, are there any? I know you mentioned a couple of authors earlier, but are there any other
Yeah.
things that are more abolition focused?
So anything that I mentioned before will get you in the right direction. I will also put up the group Critical Resistance. They are like one of my pillars, like total goals, but they do a lot of education and organizing around that. And I would also say if you're interested in like what an abolitionist alternative to the current system is, I would look into transformingharm.org. Miriam Kaba, who I mentioned earlier, created that website, but it has like a ton of resources on transformative justice, alternatives to policing, and just tons and tons of other information about building an abolitionist present. That's something she talks about a lot instead of like, what would an abolitionist future look like? Like we're building it now by addressing these things in our communities now. So.
Ooh, that's such an interesting answer and super relevant to our next question, which is that while abolition may be the ultimate goal, what sort of reforms slash changes would you recommend as short-term goals to improve our justice system while moving towards abolition?
Okay, that's a really good question. I'm going to introduce the difference between reformist reforms and non reformist reforms. Um, Reformist reforms are kind of the criminal justice reform that we're all pretty familiar with. They're things like body cams and increased training and things like that that keep the system fairly intact, but will aim to alter slight aspects of it. Non reformist reforms are basically abolitionist baby steps. So they're reforms that will reduce harm in the interim as we move towards this future that we're building. And those include things like not rehiring police who have been accused of misconduct or convicted of misconduct. They include things like the cost of pension or like removing pensions and having police pay the cost themselves when it comes to harm that they've caused. Um, there is a really good graphic by Critical Resistance that outlines like questions you should ask if you're evaluating different reforms. And a lot of the questions are, does this increase funding to the prison industrial complex, or does it decrease it? Does this offer more technologies for them to use, or does it decrease the technologies they have available? Does this question the idea that police and prisons keep us safe, or does that reinforce this idea? So those are some things to think about when you're evaluating reforms, but that is important to keep in mind that, like, yes, like, and there's a vision of a utopia where we could just snap our fingers and get rid of this, but that's not how our world is built today. So what steps can we take to get there?
I love that. Yeah. And having those structural questions to ask as you're evaluating reforms is very, very useful. And I saw Carolyn just pinged in the chat the critical resistance site. So if anyone wants to check out that resource, feel free. I also got a question from someone asking if you can clarify the phrase non revisionist reforms.
Yeah. So non-reformist reforms, basically reformists are people who believe that the system can be reformed, like that as it exists, it can be reformed in a way that works for us. No, abolitionists don't believe that. They're working to build alternative systems entirely. So they are non-reformists, but they do offer some reforms that can get us there or can mitigate harm in the meantime.
Right. So the non-reformists are kind of like on the path to prison abolition, whereas reformist reforms are kind of more like okay with the system and just trying to change it from within.
Exactly.
Makes a lot of sense. And then another question about the juvenile justice system. Are there restorative justice programs available for many individuals within the juvenile justice system?
Yes, there are. That's sort of, I don't know if I want to call it a trend or not, but there definitely are systems who are practicing restorative justice, especially restorative justice circles within facilities and different ways to encourage kids to take accountability for some harm that they have caused or to relate to others in different ways. Um, Again, that's because the system is so varied across jurisdictions, that's something that's not like universal, and it will look differently in different areas or in different systems, but that's definitely something that is happening in facilities and in communities.
And do you think it actually works?
So I've never been a part of a restorative justice circle. I do know that restorative justice was originally introduced as an alternative to the current system that we have. And so when like the current system sort of co-opted that practice, transformative justice emerged as a different alternative to the criminal legal system. I think the sticking point is that our current legal system disincentivizes taking accountability because you don't want to be convicted. You don't want to be found guilty. Like that's the point. With kids, it's a little different in terms of how that operates, but the basic premise of restorative justice is like, I want to take accountability and restore the harm that's caused. But that doesn't happen if you've been coerced into taking accountability because you've been sentenced. Like it's not voluntary, which was a fundamental premise of restorative justice. So I think it can work, especially for interpersonal things like within facilities. But I think in terms of a truly like transformative process, restorative justice within the context of the criminal legal system is not ideal.
Okay. Yeah, so one isn't totally consistent with the other. Okay. And then one final question, because I know we're at time. What do you think it will take to summon enough political will to implement transformative reforms?
Oh, goodness gracious. It'll take,
Good question.
I know, I think it will take every single person to have that will and to be willing to push for it. I was on a webinar earlier today that said inertia is not on our side. Like we can't just wait for it to happen. We can't sign a change.org petition and say this is going to happen. Like it requires people to work for it. And I think especially with abolition, if that's what people are working towards, it's not comfortable. It's not a fun process. It requires recognizing that we all cause harm. And so taking accountability for the harm that you've caused, which I have to say isn't very fun. So I think it will require everyone to be like committed to doing that work and to connect with other people who are committed to doing that work. And then to work on doing that wherever you are. So I don't think that there's like one thing that we all need to be doing. Like, if you are working on securing housing for people, that's an abolitionist project. If you're giving people access to education, that's an abolitionist project. Anything that you're doing to help people take care of themselves and each other is an abolitionist project. So I think it will take everyone being committed to that, and just really like staying committed to the idea that like a better world is possible. We just have to build it.
Mm. I think that's a perfect note to end on. And yeah, a surprisingly uplifting ending, I would say. Thank you so much for this conversation, Hannah. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you all for attending and for all of your great questions. We're really hoping to do more events focused on the criminal justice system. So let us know what you thought of this one and keep an eye out for more from our social media and newsletter. And if you don't already follow us, please follow us at Women's Wire across platforms and subscribe to our newsletter at womenswiremedia.org. And yeah, just wanted to end with a reminder to take care of yourselves and each other. And thank you.